No large country is exempt from the cult of the hero, from the fervor for its great men.
In the case of the United States, the Ari is no man to whom the country pays more tribute than to George Washington, the victorious general of the American War of Independence, who later became the first president of the nation. Behind his extraordinary story is a man with many facets. He was known as a master military strategist, but he made several mistakes that almost cost the Americans the war.
He fought for a liberal cause, but he had hundreds of slaves.
He established himself as the father of the country, but he never had children of his own.
Washington, the founding father of the United States, was a uniquely American man. And today in the new encyclopedia, we are going to learn about his fascinating life. And don't forget to support this initiative by following us on our Instagram account, which you can find below the video. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732 in the English colony of Virginia. The Washington family had emigrated to Virginia from England in the 1650s and became one of the wealthiest families in the country. In the colony, they owned several tobacco plantations where hundreds of slaves worked, forming part of the new aristocracy that had formed in this territory conquered by the English. Augustine Washington, George's father, was quite active in local politics, working as a justice of the peace and as a county sheriff. But Augustine died suddenly when George was only 11 years old, and much of the Washington estate was managed by George's older brother, named Lawrence, whom George idolized as a brother. Young George was trained as an agricultural technician and also showed his talent as a mapmaker and craftsman.
But the teenage George was not content with such a quiet profession and longed for adventure.
His adventure came unexpectedly when his brother Lawrence died of tuberculosis in 1752. Which made George the descendant of the prominent Washington family. Shortly after this, Washington joined a commission in the colonial militia and was named major by the lieutenant governor of the colony. Washington joined the British Army at a very dangerous time, as on the frontier, west of the already established British colonies, the Ohio River Valley was being disputed by both Britain and France, and both were building fortresses in strategic places to strengthen their control over the territory. In this way, Washington was appointed deputy commander of the Virginia Regiment, the first professional colonial military unit, and was ordered to march to the forks of the Ohio to oppose the French movement that took place in 1754. On the way to Ohio, the regiment's commander broke his neck falling off his horse and died shortly after the incident, so the leadership fell into the hands of a not-so-experienced George Washington. When the commander's hour arrived at the fork, he discovered that the French had gotten there first and started construction of their own fortress for the battle called Fort Duquesne. Washington withdrew to study his next move, and in the process was joined by a friend he had met a year earlier, a member of the Mingo tribe named Tanachari Son. Tanachari Son informed Washington about a group of about 35 French soldiers approaching their position and suggested an imminent attack. The two groups indeed confronted each other, and what happened next has been a subject of controversy. What is known for certain is that by the end of the confrontation, almost the entire French detachment was dead, including its commander. The French claimed sometime later that they were there on a completely peaceful diplomatic mission that was massacred, while Washington thought the French were there to expand their forces and attack. The truth is that this battle turned out to be one of the triggers of an international war between Great Britain and France, known as the 7 Years' War. After this episode, the commander of the French garrison at Fort Duquesne released 600 soldiers and attacked Washington on July 3.
The undisciplined Virginians fled under French fire.
The French offered Washington to return with his unarmed troops to Virginia if he surrendered.
Washington felt he had no choice, and he
marched to what he thought was his disgrace and the end of his military career.
To his surprise, the Virginia House attributed the defeat to factors other than Washington. The following year, the British sent a force of 2,000 soldiers under the command of General Edward Braddock in order to retake Fort Duquesne. Washington guided them, having prior experience in the area and territory. But this battle was another disaster. On July 9, 1755, 2/3 of the British soldiers were killed or injured.
Washington gained some reputation during the battle for forming a rear guard to prevent the troops' retreat from turning into an even greater massacre.
Washington served in the colonial militia until 1758, when he resigned in disgust after being rejected in his attempt to secure a royal commission in the British Army.
The British commanders dismissed Washington and other colonial leaders as being novices and simpletons to them.
This judgment of the British would come back to haunt them later.
In 1759, Washington married Martha Custis, a wealthy young widow who had one of the largest plantations in Virginia.
This, combined with his own possessions, made Washington the richest man in the colonies. He was happy raising his stepchildren Jack and Patsy Custis, but he never had his own children with Martha, despite being married for over 40 years.
Smallpox contracted in his youth may have left him sterile, it is believed.
Washington began his political life serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses.
It's important to note that even at this time, ideas of independence from the British Empire were flourishing. This idea in Washington grew during the 1760s and 1770s due to the British Parliament's attempt to exert more control over the American colonies through taxes and other measures. Washington, like many others, believed this was an act of tyranny because the Americans didn't have enough representation in the British government, a government that was creating the laws they were subject to, despite not having enough representation according to them. The growing tension that was there finally turned into an open conflict in Boston, where the British troops under the command of General Thomas Gage were trying to subdue an increasingly rebellious colonial population, increasingly in protest and won over to the feelings of independence. On April 19th, the British and the colonial militia had their first confrontation, which would formally start the American War of Independence.
The delegates from the 13 colonies, increasingly in favor of independence,
Gathered at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1775, a convention in which Washington represented Virginia. This convention is the one that a year later would adopt the Declaration of Independence in the United States. On June 14, 1775, the Congress created a Continental Army to work for the common defense of the colonies. And as they began discussions about who would command this new army, they immediately thought of Washington. Being the most famous soldier in the colony due to his service of over 20 years in the war, they made him the perfect candidate elected unanimously to lead the new army.
On June 19th, Washington received his commission and left for Boston 3 days later.
when he got there, he found out that his army was actually an improvised group of united militias without really an effective organization.
The British, for their part, had retreated to the city and the Patriots, as the supporters of independence began to call themselves, blocked the land routes to the city and besieged it.
While containing the British in Boston, Washington immediately turned the militia into a more apt and formed army.
In October, King George III of Great Britain replaced General Gage with the new commander, William Howe.
Finally, in March of 1776, the Patriot Army managed to place cannons on a high strategic site and began to bombard the positions of the British who were in Boston.
This forced Howe to retreat to Halifax by the sea, and thus the Americans won their first victory.
Washington was not going to relax after that. However, a few weeks later, he moved his army south, specifically to the city of New York.
Both Washington and Howe knew that New York was key to controlling the country, and
Washington expected the British to attack there.
That's why Washington spent a few months preparing the fortifications and continued training his troops. British ships began arriving at the port of New York on July 2nd, while the Continental Army boosted their morale a few days later when they received news of the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, which stated that the colonies declared themselves as free and independent states. However, on August 22nd, General Howe landed in Brooklyn, at the western end of Long Island.
5 days later, he attacked Washington's position with 20,000 soldiers, dealing a hard defeat to the American patriots.
Washington organized a stealthy night retreat across the West River and onto Manhattan Island.
The British were surprised the next day when they discovered that the Americans had simply left. However, the British followed them to Manhattan, causing a new panicked flight of the Patriots.
Washington was furious at the cowardice of his men and wanted to stay and fight, but an aide had to take the reins of the general's horse and take him away when he was about to be attacked by the British.
New York fell shortly after and was reclaimed and occupied by the British for the rest of the war. The Continental Army was pressed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania when winter fell, and Howe stopped the pursuit, because in the 18th century, armies usually did not fight in winter. So Howe returned to New York to wait for the spring thaw.
Meanwhile, Washington knew he had to do something.
Morale was at its lowest, desertions were increasing, and if he didn't act fast, his entire army was going to dissolve.
By mid-1776, Washington had already developed an effective spy network and received information that a garrison of 1,500 German mercenaries were in winter quarters near Trenton, New Jersey.
The Germans weren't expecting an attack, and that was precisely what Washington planned to take advantage of, also hoping that a victory would boost the Patriots' morale and provoke an increase in volunteers for the army.
On Christmas night, Washington stealthily led his army to the night crossing of the Delaware River into New Jersey, a military feat.
Noteworthy.
And on the morning of December 26th, the Continental Army took the mercenaries by surprise and captured 800 of them. They also took tons of supplies and weapons to equip their army.
A few days after the battle, the British attacked Washington's position in Trenton, but were repelled in another of Washington's great military maneuvers.
The maneuver consisted of surrounding the British Army and attacking the garrison in Princeton, thus achieving the third defeat of the British in just 10 days. The British retreated to southern New Jersey, and Washington finally went to winter quarters in Morristown.
This impressive series of victories saved Washington's army. But the war was far from over.
The British plan for the war in 1777 was more complex than the previous year.
An invasion led by General John Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny for his elaborate uniforms and his luxurious lifestyle, advanced south from Quebec to take Albany, New York. The goal was to isolate New England, which had the highest concentration of patriots.
British General Howe was supposed to send troops from New York to support General Burgoyne, but for reasons not so clear to this day, he simply did not.
One can look to supposed personal rivalries among the high-ranking British commanders.
As they did not send the reinforcements, in the summer of 1777, the British left New York to conquer Philadelphia, where they met up with the Continental Army and defeated Washington at the Battle of Brandywine. In September, British troops entered Philadelphia, the headquarters of the Patriots, and the Continental Congress fled to York and Pennsylvania.
But the real action was north of New York, where unknowingly Sir Johnny had led his men straight into a trap.
Burgoyne was quickly surrounded by Continental troops led by Horatio Gates, and as the much-anticipated reinforcements from Howe never arrived,
he was defeated by the Americans in the Battle of Saratoga in September and October, so on October 17th, he was forced to surrender and hand over his army.
Burgoyne's surrender was a big shock to the whole world.
In the case of Paris, from the beginning of the war, the French government was looking for reasons to support the United States' independence cause, as that way it could hurt its British rivals.
The American victory at Saratoga convinced King Louis XVI that the American patriots could rise as a fighting force, and began a formal alliance between France and the Americans at the end of 1777. In this alliance, they promised the troops money supplies, and more importantly, a naval fleet, something that the independent Continental Army lacked.
Meanwhile, the American Horatio Gates took much of the credit for the victory, even though he had not contributed to the overall strategy of the battle. This was to promote himself to replace Washington as the general-in-chief of these armies, but his attempt ultimately failed. For his part, Washington's army set up its winter camp in Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia.
That winter was brutally cold and snowy, causing the deaths of approximately 2,500 American soldiers.
The American cause benefited from the presence of two foreign officers who were serving the cause. The Marquis de Lafayette was one of them.
Lafayette, a 19-year-old French nobleman, sailed to America in late 1777 against the orders of his king, and Washington proclaimed him a general in his army.
Lafayette brought the Americans new knowledge about European warfare and had a positive effect on the army's morale.
It is believed that he played a role in achieving the eventual alliance between France and the United States.
The second important character was the man Friedrich von Steuben, a former officer and administrator of the Prussian army who left Germany after being accused of having homosexual relationships.
The man Friedrich arrived in Valley Forge in February of 1778.
And was appointed Inspector General of the Army, where he developed a training and formation program that turned the Continental Army into a true professional fighting force.
The most characteristic of the inspector were his elaborate and colorful clothes and his habit of cursing at the soldiers in different languages. As for the British General Howe, facing the consequences of the 1777 campaign, he resigned and was replaced by Henry Clinton. Clinton left Philadelphia and returned to New York, pursued by Washington.
Both armies fought a battle on June 28.
At Monmouth, and returned to New York to discover a French fleet in the harbor there.
The French had declared war on Great Britain, and what had until then been a regional civil conflict became a continental conflict.
This war involved several European powers, so the British government now
Sent fewer reinforcements to their armies in North America because they were more concerned about protecting their Caribbean possessions.
The focus of the war shifted south after the British took the city of Charleston in North Carolina.
In early 1780, an army led by Lord Cornwallis defeated Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden. This ended Gates's military career, who was replaced by General Nathanael Greene, who applied the tactic of attack and retreat against Cornwallis's army, which delayed his advance to northern Virginia. Washington, who now had an increase in his ranks due to the French soldiers and their French naval fleet, received news that Cornwallis had moved his army to Yorktown and sensed that this was the opportunity to trap him.
So Washington moved his army from New York to Virginia, and soon Cornwallis was surrounded.
He couldn't retreat by sea because the French fleet had blocked him, and Washington's troops had besieged his fortifications.
After 2 weeks of battle, Cornwallis realized there was no longer any hope and surrendered to the Revolutionary Army on October 19, 1781. The effects of the defeat at Yorktown caused the collapse of Prime Minister Frederick North's mandate in London, better known as Lord North, and the new government called for peace talks. In September of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, where Great Britain recognized the United States of America as an independent nation, and the last British troops left New York at the end of 1783.
Thus, against all odds of difficulties, George Washington and the Continental Army won the war and obtained their independence.
Now, Washington was a national hero, and several members of Congress made a proposal to offer him the title of king, but Washington refused.
At that time, at the head of the army, he could have easily taken power, but he refused to establish a new monarchy.
So in December of 1783, Washington voluntarily resigned as general-in-chief and retired to his lands in Mount Vernon.
But this retirement didn't last long, as the Confederation laws governing the nation quickly proved to be inadequate, and a national constitution was needed to establish the new independent government of the United States.
So they called Washington out of his retirement to serve as the president of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. There he oversaw the creation of a document that more than 200 years later still serves as the founding charter of American law and as a benchmark for Republican Constitution for many countries around the world.
The first election for the presidency of the United States took place in 1788, and Washington was elected as the nation's first president, assuming this historic office in New York on April 19, 1789.
As the first president, Washington defined many of the precedents that still serve the executive power.
During his term, he established that he should be called Mr. President instead of more elaborate titles such as His Excellency or His Highness. He also laid the groundwork for the famous inaugural address and the first presidential speech in the House of Congress.
In addition, Washington structured the executive power in a form of cabinet that still largely persists today.
As president, Washington spent a lot of time in mediating conflicting factions within his cabinet.
And as president, he did not belong to any political party.
In fact, he didn't even like the idea of these organizations existing. Although the same could not be said for Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, or Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Hamilton believed that the future of the nation lay in a strong federal government, a national banking system, and trade between cities. So he set about forming the Federal Party to advance this project.
For his part, Jefferson preferred a decentralized government, controlled by each state and with an economy centered on agricultural activity.
For his part, Jefferson was not very fond of the growing prominence that banks were gaining, so he formed the Democratic-Republican Party to advance this project.
Both were great rivals, and frequently cabinet meetings ended in shouting, with Washington having to intervene to maintain order.
Washington saw Hamilton's vision more favorably and spent most of his first term solving economic problems.
By 1792, Washington was already exhausted from years of military campaigning and politics and showed no interest in running for a second term.
However, all parties begged him to run, and he was unanimously re-elected.
In 1796, he flatly refused to
Ran for a third term and decided to retire.
This set another precedent for the Republican tradition of that country.
Until Franklin Roosevelt, in 1940, and after Roosevelt died after his fourth term, no other president served more than 2 terms in the country's history.
Eventually, Congress passed an amendment that set a limit of only 2 terms in federal law.
So Washington retired again to his lands in Mount Vernon to seek a quieter life.
In 1796, John Adams was elected vice president, and
During this time, relations with France deteriorated severely, especially in the wake of the French Revolution.
These were tumultuous times, and it seemed that a war was looming. So in 1798, Washington accepted the position of Commander-in-Chief of the United States to defend his country in case of attack.
But no army appeared, and Washington did not have to return to serve as a general in any battle.
In December of 1799, Washington began to have a sore throat that worsened each day.
Several doctors were called, but none agreed on what was causing this illness, and none knew what to do. At some point, nearly half a liter of blood was drawn from Washington, as this was a fairly common medical practice at the time.
But this probably made things even worse.
On December 14th, around 10:30 in the evening, George Washington died at the age of 67. The news of his death unleashed a wave of national mourning that would lead to a heartfelt funeral in the country.
On December 18th, General Henry Lee, known as Light Horse Harry, was the one who delivered Washington's eulogy.
This would later have an ironic twist, as his son Robert E.
Lee was the main figure in the rebellion of the states that sought to separate from the American nation, in which George Washington played a crucial role in its foundation.
At the time of his death, Washington had over 300 slaves. This was an essential element in the creation of his family's wealth.
However, ideas against slavery were proliferating, and as he aged, he became more uncomfortable with this situation.
In his will, Washington ordered that half of his slaves be freed after his death and the rest be freed after the death of his wife Martha.
Martha died in 1802 at age 70. George and Martha Washington were buried in a tomb at Mount Vernon, where they still remain, despite the United States government's attempt to move them to a tomb in Washington District of Columbia, the new capital named after the nation's first president.
After her death, they were erected in her honor, commemorative monuments.
The Washington Monument, which is 555 feet tall, was completed in 1888, and due to a federal law passed in 1910 to limit the height of buildings.
In Washington District of Columbia, that monument is the tallest building in the city and will likely remain so in the future.
Washington's military and political career marked the birth of the United States. He quickly became a national myth, the person every American aspired to become.
With his strengths and mistakes, he entered the category of men who managed to mark the history of a people.
As a human being, Washington was a more complicated figure.
As a public man, Washington is the father of the American nation.
Perhaps Light Horse Harry Lee understood him best when he described him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.
I hope you enjoyed this video.
Don't forget to subscribe, as there are many more quality videos coming, plus all the ones we have already published. I also invite you to follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and well, see you next time and take care.